Welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
And let's go with this. And here we are. So we are still in the midst of discussing a case of homicide. That's what we've been discussing, and the distinctions that need to be made within homicide cases. And the Torah has mentioned to us what happens in a case of manslaughter. And at this particular point, we're talking about the case where a person intends, where it's an intentional act, right? Okay. V'chi yazid ish al re'ehu. And if a person acts maliciously, that's zadon. The word zadon is the word that we use to act intentionally. So when it comes to sinning, right, an act that's an act against what the divine will is, right? If one contravenes the divine will, and these are words that we use on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. So there's a concept of a complete accident where it's not under your control at all. You weren't necessarily doing anything that you knew was dangerous or that was life-threatening anyway, or that was going to be actually a violent.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I thought we were on a later verse.
Really?
I think we've done 14. I think we've done 15. I think
Okay.
There were a lot of Rashis on 16, and I think we'd done some of them.
All right. I don't know why then I'm there. Forgive me. Okay. Yeah, we're here. Sorry. That's right. We are. Okay. I don't know that I explained this the other day, did I?
Which part? Because I think we did the first Rashi.
He did. I recollect that. Oh, well, it's part of.
Let's see. But I don't know if we did the other two Rashis on this, on verse 16.
Right. Yeah. No, let's take a look here. I did mark in what we did. Yeah, we did. I remember yesterday how we did a case of kidnapping, right? We were in the middle.
But I don't think we finished. There were a lot of long Rashis. I'm not sure that we finished that.
Right. We didn't get to that. We didn't get to the end of that.
Yeah.
Right. Excuse me. Right. I remember that now distinctly. Anyway, I don't remember that I had clarified the basic 4 categories of sinning, in the sense of where you have no choice. It's a complete accident. You're not, and of course, you're not basically held liable. It's something to think about if it happens to you. Okay. And then there's the case of you didn't know it was the wrong thing to do. Right? You had no idea, or for example, if it's a violation of the Shabbat, you didn't know it was Shabbos, or you didn't know that specific act was forbidden on Shabbat, or you didn't know that a person that there are these 39 categories of labor that are forbidden on the Shabbat, and you didn't know that. Any of this whole concept of Shabbat and ceasing from specific kinds of labor on Shabbat, you didn't know about that, and you committed any one of these things. That is considered shogeg. This is unintentional. It's not your intention. You're doing it essentially out of ignorance. Are you still held liable? Yes. We know, I remember learning this as a school child, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. When you tell the traffic cop you didn't realize you had to stop at a red light or at a stop sign, you're still going to be in trouble. It's not, in fact, your license will be taken away. But that's shgaga. And then there's intentional, in the sense that you know what you're doing. You know what you're doing. You know you're doing something wrong, and you still do it, not out of a sense of rebellion, because that is the last category. Okay, where you're doing it to show who's boss, that you're doing it, you know it's wrong, you know that it's a divine commandment, and you still do it, but you're doing it to prove that you don't believe in God, or you just, or rather, I suppose it would say you believe in God, or but you're not going to do what God tells you what to do. That's rebellion. So we have these categories in terms of the seriousness of the infraction. Okay, so there's that sense. All right, so now we're on to this case now of kidnapping. Please forgive me for my lapse at this point. That's a personal comment. Let me just do this. So we were in this case of kidnapping. We find the individual who's stolen in the possession of the kidnapper, and it is considered a capital punishment. Okay. Let's see here. All right. Let me find the place where we are. I think I have a mark. There it is in the Rashi. Nimtza biyado. This is a case. Thank you, Lauren, by the way. Please forgive me. And he is found in his possession. This individual who was stolen is found in the possession of the one who stole him. And here's the point. Shera'uhu edim sheganvo umacharo. So interesting how the tradition understands this text. The point about this, that when it says he's found in his hand, is that the witnesses saw him. They actually saw him. They were eyewitnesses. They saw how he stole this person and sold him. In other words, the idea here is when it says found in his possession, it means, in fact, that they witnessed what happened. And this is a level of testimony that is required in order to then make this a capital case. V'nimtza biyado kfar kodem mechira. So it says, and what this adds, the reason why the Torah states it the way it does, is that he may not have actually been physically taken, and in other words, the purchase, the sale of this individual may not have been completed. What this means is he is found in his possession already prior to the sale. And I think what this is saying is I'm without absolute certainty, but I think the point is it doesn't have to go as far as the physical transfer of this individual to the other person. In other words, the sale does not have to be completed. That is my understanding of this. It's ambiguous because it could mean, of course, that it's before he is sold itself and that he's simply found in his possession. It could mean that. But my sense is that in order for it to be a capital liability, he doesn't have to go as far as actually transferring the person into the purchaser's possession, but he's had to start a sale going on. Motumat.
It sounds kind of like sex trafficking.
It could be. It could be. It involves any kind of trafficking. At least here, it is not limited to sex trafficking. But again, the fact that you raised that actually raises a point that I would want to make, that these punishments are very severe. And it isn't always because, in actual fact, they carried out these punishments. I think the Torah is trying to teach us and is trying to give us a sense of how serious these particular infractions are, because there's an excuse in general for sinning when one sins is to minimize what you're doing. And that involves basically any kinds of infractions is to somehow excuse them in some way or another. And by associating these things as capital offenses, the Torah is making it very clear, laying down very clearly that these are very serious offenses, human offenses. So how heinous these things really are. So, Mot yumat, he shall surely be put to death. It's from right up here, right? He shall surely be put to death. Bechenek, so Rashi, the tradition shares the tradition that when it simply says put to death without a specific way of being put to death, it means bechenek, it means strangulation. And he goes on to make the general rule. Kol mitah ha'amura b'Torah stam. okay, that whenever the Torah mentions a capital punishment, without specifying it, in other words, stam, without specifying what the nature of that capital punishment is, chenek hi. It simply means it is strangulation. We're to understand it as meaning strangulation. Vehifsik ha'inyan, okay, and the reason why the Torah changed the subject, in other words, the sentence that preceded this case of kidnapping was a case of a person striking one of their parents, right? And wounding, I should say, wounding one of their parents. So he says the Torah changed the subject, v'katav v'gonev ish bein makeh aviv ve'imo, and wrote the law about stealing a person, kidnapping, between one who wounds his father or his mother, the mekalel aviv ve'imo, to the next subject, because you're going to see the very next sentence is umekalel aviv ve'imo, and one who curses his father or his mother, mot yumat, right? He shall surely be put to death. So that's also got to do with a person's trying to injure his parents in some way or another, right? And this subject is a completely different subject, kidnapping. So Rashi's saying, why did the Torah put the subject of kidnapping in between, right? That's what he's trying to deal with, okay? Near Eli, okay, he says, this appears to me, okay, Hainu plukta demansavar. He says, this has to do with a legal dispute, okay, in other words, a discussion between scholars, demansavar, because this one opinion, one authority holds, makshinan haka'a leklala, that one has to connect striking, wounding with cursing, uman savar lo makshinan, and another authority holds that one doesn't actually connect the two, that one has to make a distinction. So exactly, this Rashi is a little bit confusing because, let me see, I'm trying to say, okay, it does, okay, forgive me. I'm going to reread this Rashi on one sentence, okay? Okay, so he simply seems to, my initial way of looking at this Rashi was to understand that he's explaining why this is happening. And it looks to me now that I need to read this simply as a statement. And it's not an explanation. In other words, he simply says, and the Torah makes a distinction between wounding a person and striking a person. And it doesn't, I'm trying to think of how he is saying, I believe I'm reading the abbreviations correctly, that he's just simply saying he just makes a distinction. But I am not sure. I am a little puzzled right now by this Rashi, because the first part is clear enough, his explanation that when it talks about mitah, it's simply talking about chenek, okay? And I'm not sure and then he's commenting on the fact that the Torah changes the subject briefly and goes back to the subject of the relationship with the parents, right? And he's just simply saying that's what the Torah does, right? And then he says that the fact that it does that is a reason that there's some, in the discussion in the Talmud, there's some discussion as to whether or not striking and cursing are to be connected or not connected. So again, what would we mean by connected? Well, let's keep going and see if we find the answer. Issue is this, that possibly connecting them, that if the Torah connected the two, the Torah might be saying to us that you have to actually do the two. In other words, you have to both curse and wound in order for it to be a capital offense, and the fact that it's just putting this in between, the kidnapping case in between, all right, is to separate the two, and that you don't have to, one of them is a sufficient cause for a capital offense. So I hope in trying to parse this out with you that I'm being relatively clear. And if you have a question, you need to ask me a clarifying question. I'm going to pause a second, give you that opportunity. Or raise your hand and I'll stop. Okay, I'm going to assume that what I'm saying to you is reasonably clear. Let me keep going. So now we are going into umekalel aviv ve'imo, one who curses his father and his mother, mot yumat, will be certainly put to death. It is without question a capital offense. Let's do this. Umekalel aviv ve'imo, and one who curses his father and his mother. Lama ne'emar, why is this stated? Lefi shehu omer, because it states elsewhere in the book of Leviticus, where it talks about this law again, it says, ish asher yikalel et aviv. It says, every individual, right? Every individual who curses his father. So it says it there. Ein li ela ish. In that case, if we only had that case in Leviticus, right, we would have to understand that it's only talking about a man, an adult male, shekilel et aviv, who cursed his father. Isha shekilala et aviha. What about a woman who cursed her father? Minayin. How do we include her in this law? Remember, as we said before yesterday, how in interpreting Torah law, we want to apply it in the absolute, unquestionably way in which it can be understood, which means that if there's a maximum way to apply it or a minimum way, we're going to go with the minimum way. So how do we know that a woman, so we'd have to have it explicitly because the Torah says a man, an adult male. So how do we know if an adult female curses her father? Minayin, how do we know she's also included in this law? Talmud lomar. That's why in this verse it states, umekalel aviv ve'imo. It says, one who curses his father and his mother. Stam bein ish uvein isha. So it doesn't specify whether it's a man or a woman. Imkain. Okay, so let's turn this around. If this is the case, lama ne'emar ish asher yikalel. So then why in that latter verse in Leviticus does it say a man who curses? Lohotzi et hakatan, to exclude a minor. So a minor child who curses their parents is not, that's not considered a capital offense. Right, okay. So now it says mot yumat. Okay. So it doesn't say yumat, it says mot yumat, will certainly be put to death. It uses this expression. And when the Torah just simply we've learned that when the Torah says yamut, just will die, it means chenek, it means strangulation. But here it said mot yumat. So notice, please, I'm going to show you the distinction, right? So this is interesting though. It says mot yumat, and here it says mot yumat. Now it says, however, biskila. Okay. So here he says it means biskila, it means through stoning. But there's an explanation. V'chol makom, but any place, shene'emar damav bo, because it goes on to say, in the other, I'm going to have to assume that it's the Leviticus verse that says his blood is upon him. And to use that expression, that's an expression that means he is guilty of a capital offense. But it's another way of putting it, right? His blood is upon him, meaning he has to pay back for the fact that he's taken a life. But he says, Rashi says, that this particular expression, damav bo, means skila. How do we know this? You may well be asking. So he says, Uvinyan av lechulam. He says that the binyan av means the foundation, the basic foundation on which we draw this conclusion. In other words, that there's a case where this is clarified is in chapter 20 of Leviticus. It says, Ba'even yirgamu otam, because in Leviticus 20 it says, with a stone they shall stone them, damehem bam, and then it uses, their blood is upon them. So it connects damehem bam with the idea that when it says that, it means through stoning. Uve'makalel aviv goes on to say, and regarding one who curses his father, ve'imo, and his mother, ne'emar damav bo. So in Leviticus, in the parallel passage in Leviticus, it says damav bo. It uses that phrase, damav bo. And that's why we can then infer from that verse in Leviticus that it refers back to our verse here in Exodus, where it simply says mot yumat, even though mot yumat normally means to strangulation, where it talks about the specific verse of cursing one's parents. It says damav bo, and then it also says they shall, in Leviticus 20, it uses that expression mot yumat, and then goes on to say damav bo, and even yirgamuotam, they shall stone them. So I'm giving you this is of course a very complicated piece of Rashi that we're doing here. I hope I've done relative justice to it in the sense that you followed the argumentation and you've now gotten an actual sense of what makes Talmud study complicated. And you either find this fascinating and you love the logic that's involved in trying to parse out the exact meaning of this law. And of course, again, the implication is that you love Torah to the degree where you don't lose patience and you're willing to parse out exactly what the meanings are. And I've used this example a few times. I think I've also used it in this class, is that you can look at the Torah as a love letter that God has sent the Jewish people. And if you recollect, you may have had this experience where when you fell in love with someone and then you got a communication from them, especially if it was a written communication from the person you loved, you don't just read that letter once. You read it many, many times. And as you're reading this letter, you're thinking to yourself, well, what did they mean by that? What are they trying to tell me here? What exactly? And so it's the same sort of dynamic that's going on here in this process that we are going through right now. Please feel free to ask a question, a clarifying question, if there's anything you need me to explain. Otherwise, maybe if we go over this on the recording a time or two, it'll make more sense. Let me continue. Okay. We'll take verse 18. V'chi yirevun anashim. And if two men are fighting each other, they're quarreling. V'hika ish et re'ehu, and the man smote, he wounded, he struck his fellow, the Evan, with a stone, or ve'egrof, or with his fist. Ve'lo yamut, and the person doesn't die. Ve'nafal lemishkav, and in fact, though, nafal lemishkav means he is confined to his bed. In other words, so this person has injured. We're now introducing the subject of bodily injury, of causing somebody bodily injury, but not killing them. So let's take a look here. I'm going to take a few verses so as to give you a better context of what the Torah is saying. Im yakum, if this person gets out of bed, right? V'hitalech bachutz, and goes outside. He's able to, in other words, continue normally. Al mishanto, but he is requiring something to lean on. Right, so he's injured. He can get up. He's capable of getting up out of bed and going outside, is the way the Torah is describing it. But he needs some kind of support in order to do this. The nikah hamakeh, it's saying the one who struck him is cleared of a capital offense, is the point it's making.
Rabbi, mine seems to imply that it's not that he's leaning on a crutch, but it says if he gets up and walks about on his own support, and then, and it further says in the Rashi, it says with his health and his strength, as opposed to an implement.
Okay, so right now I'm just trying to, a mishan means something you lean on, okay? So what the way you're translating it appears to be the way Rashi understands this, meaning the tradition understands this. But right now, I'm just trying to give you the basic meaning, the translation of the words. But I would not. I think what you're proving, though, is how much we need Rashi in order to be able to, that even if we're capable of translating the Hebrew, we still need Rashi to help us understand the full meaning of these words.
Right, because it just says his support.
Correct, yeah. It does say on his support.
Right.
So it could mean his walking stick, okay? All right.
Or it could mean his, supporting himself.
Right. But the point is that the one who struck him is absolved of a capital offense. And this, now, I want to get to the end of the sentence because this is tremendously important. Rach shivto yitain, which means, in other words, if this person is now unable to do his normal work, he is now prevented from working and earning a livelihood. So the Torah now gets into this whole concept of what is called tashlumim, which would mean like compensation. So he's saying he still has to give, the one who struck him has to pay him the fact that he can't work anymore. So he's going to have to pay him the salary he would have gotten had he not been injured, the rapo yirapeh, and certainly heal him, meaning he has to also pay his medical expenses. So we now know that there are two other things, that even though this is not a capital offense, we are requiring compensation for having struck someone and caused them injury. So this is, of course, a huge, huge element of what we're talking about right now. And this is one of the things that makes Mishpatim, this Parsha of Mishpatim that we're dealing with, which, as you can see, consists of all these various laws. Okay, hold on one second, please. Okay. One second, please. Sorry. That much of this stuff is fully, this is an explosion of law, of halacha, and tractates are written about the various laws that are simply chapter headings here. So let's take a look at the Rashi with a little bit of time that we have. Okay. If people, two men are quarreling. Lama Ne'emar. So again, remember, this is basically the approach that Rashi is taking in citing the Mechilta or the Sifra. These are midrashim that are called halachic midrashim. We've talked about that before. And what they do is they don't go into this full-blown discussion that the Talmud does. But what they do is there are studies on these various laws and analyses of these various laws, in comparing and contrasting. So if you find a law in Exodus and you find a parallel law in one of the other books or even somewhere else in the same book, they make these comparisons and contrasts, and they're able to develop all kinds of ways in which to apply the law. In other words, in a sense, you could say they are able to develop what we would call oral law based on this, because this stuff isn't explicitly written in the Torah, it is implied. And what they're doing is they're showing that by comparing and contrasting these verses, you can actually logically derive ways in which to apply the law. And we've had a whole bunch of examples up to this point doing this. So you know that if you know anything about traditional Jewish law, you know that we have something called the written law, which is the Torah. This is the text that we're studying in the Torah. And we have something called oral law. And these are laws that are just as applicable as written law, but nevertheless, they aren't explicitly stated in the Torah. But these midrashim and the Talmud itself, but especially these midrashim, have the intention of showing how the oral law is actually welded to the written law. And you can't use the excuse of saying, well, it's not explicitly stated in the Torah, because if in fact we can derive it logically, and that's what we're doing, logically, then it has as much validity as if it were explicitly written in the written Torah. And that's really, really important, because there's another distinction, and that is gzerot, which is rabbinic edicts. And basically the nature of rabbinic edicts, is to perfect the Torah and prevent the violation of the written Torah, of the oral Torah. And those are somewhat more, those have to do much more, they're much more involved with circumstances as to how they're applied. So in a way, those rabbinic edicts are the way in which a judge nowadays is asked to apply the law of the land and in the specific circumstances. And this is all a way of, one has to, if you're going to actually apply law on any kind of level, whether it's divine or human, you have to have these particular ways in which to take principle and apply it to reality. So let me go on here. So we're just saying that we have the statement here that says if people are fighting, Lama Nemar, why is it stated? Lefi Nemar, why? Because later it says ayin tachat ayin. The lex talionis is what this is called. And it's the Torah itself is going to say an eye for an eye, right? Lo lamadnu. So we understand by this, the Jewish law understands that eye for an eye only means demei evarav. It has to do with financial compensation for his limb. It doesn't mean literally an eye for an eye, but it has to do with how one calculates the value of an eye. Let's see. So here we go. Aval shavat veripui. So with regard, shevet veripui. Where it says eye for an eye, we understand that it means compensation for the loss of an eye. That's one category, right? And it could also mean pain and suffering, by the way. But here we go. Aval shevet. Shevet is loss of labor, which was dealt with in this verse, right? But regarding loss of labor, veripui, and compensation for medical expenses, lo lamadnu. We do not learn that, right, from ayin tachat ayin. Lechach ne'emar. And for this reason, parshazu, the sentence is stated here. So you can see this beautiful way in which they look at these verses carefully. They look at what you can infer from those verses, what you can learn from those verses logically, and then they see how this works out. So we now have two things here. We actually have pain and suffering. In other words, the physical loss of the eye is what we're learning about. So there's the pain and suffering there. So you have to get compensated for pain and suffering. You have to get paid. You have to be paid for the fact that you've lost a limb and now you've lost an ability to see the way you were. And then you have the loss of labor. Okay, while you are healing is what it's talking about here, and also medical expenses. So there are these four categories of compensation regarding bodily injury that are mentioned and discussed in the Talmud and in Jewish law. V'nafal l'mishkav. So he.
Rabbi, we're 5 minutes over,
Okay.
and a lot of people are leaving, so.
Okay, so let me stop here. Let me go here. Put that there, and I'll put in the bookmark. So we'll know next time.
Yeah, next year.
Next year, yes, I know. Okay, sorry, let me do this. Sorry, let's go here. Okay, there we go. All right, let me stop this. Stop the share, and I'll stop the recording. And thank you. I know
I
that
hope to see